Well, that sounds a lot more like the bluegrass we were hearing at the beginning of this playlist. That was the Lonesome River Band from 1996 with Katie Daly, which is actually the playlist's first appearance of a moonshining song. And that's a central theme in bluegrass music, so I had to get one of those on here somewhere. That set started with another song about booze, This Here Bottle. That one's actually written by the guys from Hot Rise, Pete Wernick and Tim O'Brien, and that appeared on their original album Hot Rise that came out in 1979 and propelled them to the top of the bluegrass world in the 80s. They were known along with bands like Doyle Lawson and Quicksilver for reestablishing a traditional sense. They put on suits and focused on their harmonies and covering traditional old songs while keeping their new songs in a similar style to songs that had come before, just about more modern topics. But it doesn't get more traditional than a song about being lonely and having your only friend be a bottle of booze. And that's why I had to include that song from my all-time favorite band, Hot Rise. Now, after that was, of course, Doyle Lawson and Quicksilver doing a lightning quick version of Shady Grove, and that's, of course, where they get their name from just how fast those guys can pick their instruments. And Doyle's another one of these guys that comes from a long line of bluegrass history. He was in the Country Gentlemen, he was in J.D. Crowe in the New South for a period of time. He was even a member of Jimmy Martin and the Sunny Mountain Boys when he first got started. So he has this pedigree of bluegrass, and in the 80s he rose to the top of the traditional world, singing gospel songs and harmonies and just some of the fastest grass imaginable. Now, Doyle Lawson's also on the next song, Toy Heart, by the Bluegrass Album Band. The Bluegrass Album Band was a project put together by Tony Rice. He had this idea to go into the studio and use the modern recording equipment of the 80s to record the classic bluegrass songs from the 40s and 50s. And to do that, he organized a who's who of bluegrass musicians at the time. On banjo, you had J.D. Crowe. Doyle was obviously playing the mandolin. Tony was singing lead, playing lead guitar. Todd Phillips was playing bass, and then the legendary Bobby Hicks was on fiddle. Now, Bobby Hicks was also a member of the Bluegrass Boys for a time in the 50s, but he's best known for being a longtime fiddle player with Ricky Skaggs and Kentucky Thunder, another legendary bluegrass band from the 80s that just couldn't quite make it onto this list. But we did have time for the legendary fiddle player Alison Krauss. Now, her and her band Union Station released the album Two Highways in 1989. That was right around the time she was coming into her own and would go on to win Grammys and become a huge star in country music, not just in bluegrass. Now, Allison has always said that she took a lot of inspiration in the way she sings and the way she plays fiddle, actually from the way Tony Rice sings and plays guitar. And I've always thought that was really interesting, so I thought putting his vocals on Toy Heart up next to hers with Two Highways sounded really cool if you pay attention to that little bit of difference. I also think it's really cool the way that it flows right into Loggin' Man by the Del McCoury Band. Now, this is off their album Cold Hard Facts. It came out in 1996, and this is the lineup you're familiar with if you've seen the Del McCoury Band now. Jason Carter on fiddle, Ronnie McCoury on mandolin, Rob McCoury on banjo. Alan Bartram, though, wasn't in the band at the time, and Mike Bubb played the bass, while, of course, Del sang lead on this prime example of what it means to be a hard-driving bluegrass song. I really have always loved their version of Loggin' Man. It's one that Del busts out from time to time, and I think it's really cool because he actually was a loggin' man. Like, for real, Del was really a legitimate logger for a long period of time in between his original bluegrass heyday with the Dixie Pals and the Bluegrass Boys and all that kind of stuff. Before him and the boys went full-time with the Del McCoury Band, he was a logger. So I think playing the song Loggin' Man, makes a lot of sense, and it's just such a fun, fast song that it made the list as part of Del's contribution to the history of bluegrass. And then I, of course, ended the list, like we had mentioned before, with the Lonesome River Band. And they have to be on this list because so many of the bluegrass bands that came after them in the 90s and 2000s adopted elements elements of the Lonesome River Band's sound into their own bands. And that's because they were so good at creating original songs that sounded like old songs, but at the same time doing old songs in new and inventive ways. So that's why the Lonesome River Band gets included on the Bill's Bluegrass Breakdown Brief History of Bluegrass. See, it's brief, just like the title. But now we're getting ready to close things out with a leftover salmon take on a classic old time song, and then we're getting ready to get to the modern era on a brief history of bluegrass, Bill's Bluegrass Breakdown Edition. Woohoo!